Yesterday we began talking about the process of creation because Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be the anniversary of creation, and that means not just to commemorate something that happened many years ago, but rather to understand that the dynamic of creation is a recurring dynamic. So once we understand how creation works, and then we say that Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of creation, effectively what we're saying is that the dynamic of creation will repeat itself on Rosh Hashanah. So yesterday we spoke about the concept of how Hashem created the world using speech. And that tells us two things. The first thing it tells us is that in order to speak, you don't have to exert yourself to the same extent as if you had to do something physical. So that indicates that Hashem, so to speak, does not have to exert himself in order to create the world. Second of all, speaking is a relatively superficial part of human sharing. In other words, you're not necessarily sharing what's on the inside, the depth of your thoughts, of your emotions. You're just sharing what you're willing to say. And the amount that you're willing to say is minuscule compared to how much you could have said, which is nothing compared to how much you could have thought, which is obviously nothing compared to who you are, the person who produces thoughts and speech. And so obviously what we want to understand then is that when Hashem creates the world using speech, it's to indicate to us that it's really an incredibly tiny amount of divine energy that Hashem invests into the whole of creation. It's enough to completely blow our minds, but from Hashem's point of view, it's really, really minuscule. So today we'll look at the next element of speech, which is a very interesting concept, because if we're going to use a metaphor, then obviously all the components of the metaphor must align. So one of the key elements of speech is, who do you talk to? Now, of course, we know that there are people who speak to themselves, and that's fine. We do not judge anybody who speaks to themselves. In fact, there are those who say it's a sign of intelligence when you talk to yourself, so that's fine. There's no problem with speaking to yourself. The problem really is when you start listening. So, under ordinary circumstances, the purpose of speaking is for other people. That's why we were given this gift of speech, was to be able to communicate to other people. So what's the orientation of speech? The orientation of speech is towards other people. Okay, that's quite an important thing. So thought is oriented towards myself. Thought is the way that I communicate internally. And speech is the way I communicate externally. So it's oriented towards other people. Now the reason that is significant is for two reasons. The first one is because if the goal of speaking is to speak to somebody else, what that means is that if there is nobody else, there's no need for me to speak. So if there's no audience, I don't have to talk. It's very interesting, by the way, now in the world of Zoom. So recently somebody asked me, how do you give a shiur on Zoom if everybody has their cameras off? And the truth is, it's a very good question, because it's difficult to talk to an audience when you don't actually see the audience. Fortunately for me, I've spent a couple of years on radio, so you get used to it. You know, the concept, Mark, I'm sure, can tell us about it, right? On radio, you speak, there's nobody else around. You don't necessarily see the audience reaction. But by nature, the way that speaking works is there's no value in speaking if nobody is listening. So if theoretically you'd get up and everybody in the room was on their devices, or everybody in the room had fallen asleep, or people literally walk out while you're speaking, so you're not going to speak. And that leads us to the second point, which is the corollary. If you speak and you can see that people appreciate what you're saying, you can see that they're engaged, you can see that they're listening, they respond, they laugh at the appropriate times, they nod their heads, you can see their eyes light up at certain points, then you'll be encouraged to speak more. Not just more time-wise, because that's a mistake, obviously, that a lot of speakers make. They think, oh, everybody's enjoying this, so let me continue. And then they go long past the sell-by date of both the speech and the speaker. But the thing is, if you see that people are interested, you may tell them information that initially you hadn't planned to tell them. But because you see how excited they are and how interested they are, you think, you know what, this is actually an appropriate space. I'll even share that. So let's say, for argument's sake, a person was telling a chapter of their own life story. So they plan in their mind, okay, I'm going to say these details, I'm going to tell these parts of the story. But then when they see the excitement that people have listening, say, you know what, maybe I'll even share some more of the story that I wasn't originally intending to tell, because it's quite personal. But because I feel that this is a safe crowd, now I share more of myself. And so what happens with speaking, it's very interesting. Not only is speaking designed for outward expression. Not only is it designed for an audience, but the truth is that the speaker will speak relative to the audience. So no audience, I eventually lose cheshek, I lose interest, and I stop talking. Engaged audience, I feel excited and I feel enthusiastic, and so I share not only for longer, because that may not be the correct way to respond, but I definitely share more excitement, more passionate, and so on. So for this reason, we're told that if you want to talk about the process of creation recurring on an annual basis, and the process of creation is that Hashem speaks, straight away that places some kind of emphasis, not so much on the creator, but on the audience, the creations. If Hashem had created the world, let's say, through thought, then we would be absolutely irrelevant, because thoughts do not require an audience. Or for that matter, if Hashem had created the world through just action, so action also, I don't have to have an audience. If I, for example, decide that I'm going for a walk, which is a form of action, I don't need anybody else to endorse me and say, Shkoyach, that's amazing that you're going for a walk, and therefore I do it because it's an action that I do. The fact that Hashem deliberately chose to make the creative process aligned with the metaphor of speech is to straight away emphasize that there's a role for the audience to play. So as we go into Rosh Hashanah and we talk about this concept of the recreation of the world, the first thing that should come to our minds is that the world is created through speech, which means I have a role to play in the reenactment every single year. That's why you'll notice that the date that we assign as Rosh Hashanah does not align with the date of the first day of creation. It dafka aligns with the date of the sixth day of creation, when humans were introduced. Because from that point on, there is not just an audience, but there is an empowered audience. Because obviously from the minute Hashem created the first thing, there was some level of consciousness that existed in the world. Certainly by the time he had created animals, and definitely by the time he had created angels. So there was consciousness, there was an audience. But what's unique about humans is that we are an interactive audience. We're the only audience who is given the capacity to contribute in response. So we can theoretically applaud or nod our heads or say, I'm going to apply this. Whereas animals can only behave according to the instinct that Hashem gave them. And angels can only behave according to the instinct that Hashem gave them. So they can't actually contribute. It's not a big chap. If you had, for example, a robotic audience that was pre-programmed, artificial intelligence, that was pre-programmed to laugh at all your jokes, you wouldn't necessarily feel that you're a comic. But when you have people who have the capacity to think and to be critical and to be cynical, and they listen and they laugh at your jokes, then you know that you're actually funny. So that's the concept of Rosh Hashanah. Zeh hayom techilas ma'asecha. This is the day of the beginning of ma'asecha, of the actions associated with Yom Rishon, with the first day of creation. Because now there's action, now there's dynamic interplay between the speaker and the audience. There's feedback from the audience. We're that audience. So before we get into any further detail about Rosh Hashanah, the one thing that we know for certain is Rosh Hashanah is a day where our response counts. And that's why it's not such a surprise that we have all kinds of things that we're supposed to do on Rosh Hashanah. Very carefully calibrated things. For example, you're supposed to say different prayers to the rest of the year. Why different prayers? Because these prayers should express what the theme is all about, the theme of the audience response, the theme of us showing interest in what Hashem has to say because we want him to say more. In other words, we want him to invest more in his creation. Just like the enthusiastic student who sits there and shows the teacher that I don't just want to hear what's on the syllabus, I want to hear what you know. That will encourage the teacher to share more than just what is on the syllabus. So by the same token, when we show on Rosh Hashanah, we're enthusiastic. Hashem, we want to hear more of your story. That is the method Hashem has created for us to be able to elicit from him more creation, more energy, more investment than he might have given us last year. So that's why we daven extra. We say extra words of prayer to show our enthusiasm. And anybody will tell you, if you look, for example, at the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, it is the single longest silent devotion prayer that exists. But we don't just stop there at prayer. We also do things. So, for example, we blow the shofar. And let me tell you something. Blowing the shofar is not so easy. I mean, it's easy until you have to blow the amount of shofar blasts that are required on Rosh Hashanah. And then it's not so easy. And especially if you go out there and share it with other people and blow shofar for people, at home, or people who can't get to shul, people at hospital, whatever, eventually becomes quite exhausting. Why do we do it? To show Hashem, look, we're enthusiastic. We'd like you to talk some more. In fact, we're so enthusiastic that we don't only express it in the things that we do in a formal shul setting, we even show that enthusiasm at home. So even the meal that we have on Rosh Hashanah will dafka be designed in such a way so that we consistently say, look, Hashem, you see how interested I am? I'm even dipping an apple into honey because I would like you to talk to us the language of a sweet year. And I'm going to have tzimus with carrots, because we're told that carrots in Yiddish is meren, which means to multiply, and in Hebrew is gezer, which means to cut off the negative. So why am I eating this food? Because I want you to talk to us the language of multiplying, more brachas, more goodness in our lives, and cutting off the negative. And that's why we have the head of a fish, and that's why we have pomegranates, and that's why we have squash, and all the various things that people eat. Why? Because we want to show you that we're so enthusiastic. We're even doing homework. We're not only listening in shul when you're so-called speaking. Even at home, we're showing you the enthusiasm. We want to hear your story because we believe that Hashem has empowered us as an audience to be able to elicit from Him more of the narrative than possibly what we had in the previous year. That's the metaphor of speaking, which is associated with creation, which is associated with Rosh Hashanah. Please God, tomorrow we will link that metaphor to the metaphor of Hashem as a king, why that becomes a focus on Rosh Hashanah, and how that takes this metaphor to the next level.